Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I always knew my mom loved my sister more. I just didn't know she was willing to humiliate me in front of 50 people to prove it. You know that kind of truth that simmers under your skin for years? It's not loud, it doesn't scream, it just waits, like a splinter you never quite pull out, because you were told it would hurt less to ignore it. I was 8 when I first noticed it. Christmas morning. I got a doll from the clearance bin, no box, no accessories, just wrapped in leftover newspaper, like it was a mistake someone tried to fix at the last minute. My sister Tessa, 3 years younger, unwrapped a full Barbie dream house with lights that worked, an elevator, and a damn car. I remember my mom saying, "Tessa's face just lights up when she gets what she wants." As if that was the goal of every holiday, to see her face shine while the rest of us faded into the wallpaper. But I kept quiet. That was my role in the family. The helper. The fixer. The one who didn't need as much, or so they claimed. I made straight A's, never got detention, never cried in public. Tessa, meanwhile, tore through life like a sparkler lit at both ends, bright, loud, chaotic, and always leaving burns. I'm 32 now. The wedding is in 3 weeks. My fiancé Jake keeps saying, "It's our day," and I want to believe him. I want to believe that after years of being background noise in my own life, this one moment can be mine. But I've learned that with my family, nothing is truly mine unless someone else decides it's not worth stealing. Last week, I had a final fitting for my dress. My mom came along, of course, because that's what mothers are supposed to do. She spent the entire appointment complaining about how white washed me out and asking why I hadn't considered wearing something softer, like beige. Beige. For my wedding. Because apparently, standing out is still something I'm not allowed to do. Tessa didn't come, but that didn't stop Mom from showing me photos of her latest recovery retreat in Arizona, some wellness spa she couldn't afford, but somehow attended anyway. She looked tan, healthy, like someone who hadn't just drained our parents' retirement for the 3rd time in 5 years. "Your sister's finally turning things around," Mom said, tapping her phone like that made it true. "You should really reach out." I smiled like I always do and said I'd think about it, but inside I wanted to scream. Because I had reached out. For years. I covered her rent when she got fired for skipping shifts. I drove her to court appearances when she forgot she had a suspended license. I once paid off a payday loan she took out in my name. And every single time, Mom told me I was being dramatic. "She's your sister," she'd say. "You don't just give up on family." But sometimes family gives up on you, and they do it quietly, by choosing someone else over and over again until you finally stop asking why. I didn't tell Jake about the dress shop incident. He knows enough already. He's seen it all, the favoritism, the double standards, the way my parents treat Tessa's failures like temporary storms and my boundaries like betrayals. He doesn't push, but he doesn't pretend either. That's one of the things I love about him. He sees it and stays anyway. Aunt Margot called me the night after the fitting. She doesn't usually reach out. She's always been the black sheep in the family, the one who moved across the country and never came home for holidays. I used to think she was selfish. Now I think she just figured things out faster than I did. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Your mom's planning something," she said, her voice low like she thought someone might be listening. "And it's not a surprise party." My stomach dropped. I asked her what she meant, but she didn't give specifics. Just that she overheard Linda, my mom, on a call, saying something about reallocating resources and keeping things in the family. "She always used you to clean up after Tessa," Margot said, voice sharp. "Now she's gonna do it one more time. Publicly. You better be ready." I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there next to Jake, watching the shadows on the ceiling, wondering what kind of mother would sabotage her own daughter's bridal shower. I wanted to believe Margot was wrong. I wanted to believe my mom had changed, that maybe this time would be different. But people like her don't change. They just wait for a moment to remind you who they really are. The next morning, I told Jake everything. The fitting, the call with Margot, the uneasy feeling I hadn't been able to shake. He didn't look surprised. He just took a deep breath and said, "Then we plan for it." That's when we started gathering documents. Old bank statements, text threads, voicemails. Every time my family had manipulated, borrowed, stolen, or lied, we pulled it up. Not to sue, not to blackmail. Just to be ready. Just so when the moment came, and we wouldn't stand there shocked with our mouths hanging open. And deep down, I hoped maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't need it. That my mom would show up to my bridal shower with hugs and compliments and zero drama. That for once, I could have a day without being dragged through the wreckage of someone else's mess. But if you've ever been the good child, you know how this goes. The wreckage is your inheritance. The house looked like something out of a wedding magazine, all lace and soft blush tones, with those gold-lettered banners that said things like bride-to-be and love is sweet strung across the windows like everything inside wasn't about to go to hell. Someone, probably my cousin Hannah, had arranged white peonies in silver buckets along the stairwell, and there were at least 3 different kinds of cupcakes on the dessert table, each with tiny edible pearls that made biting into them feel like an act of betrayal against their beauty. My name was everywhere, calligraphed on chalkboard signs, carved into sugar cookies, even stitched into little satin napkin rings as if to say, "This is all for you, Emily. This is your day." And for the first half hour, I let myself believe it. People kept hugging me, telling me I was glowing, telling me Jake was a keeper, asking how many kids we wanted, if I was changing my last name, if we were nervous. The usual wedding fluff. I smiled and nodded and let it all wash over me like warm water, comfortable, familiar, and just distracting enough that I didn't notice my mom whispering with Tessa by the kitchen island, or the way Aunt Margot stood on the edge of it all, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to punch something delicate. Jake hadn't come inside yet. He was out back talking with my cousin's husband about some car issue or other, sipping from a thermos he always brought to family events, filled with something stronger than coffee, but disguised well enough that no one ever asked questions. He knew when to stay just out of the line of fire and when to step in, and that line was getting closer. It started after the second round of champagne mimosas, when someone rang a little silver bell and announced it was time for the gift moment. I should have known from the tone that something was off, but I was already being pulled toward the center of the room where a chair had been decorated with flowers and ribbons like a throne for someone who didn't yet realize they were being led to execution. My mom stood up front, holding a mic with the confidence of someone who believed this entire party had happened because of her, not in spite of her. She cleared her throat, smiled like a woman about to deliver news she'd spun into something noble, and said, "Before Emily opens her gifts, I just want to say a few words about family." I froze. Tessa smiled. Jake, from across the sliding doors, leaned forward slightly. Margot took one step closer to the room, like her instincts were catching up to something awful. "Family," Mom began, "isn't just about celebration, it's about sacrifice. It's about coming together when someone stumbles and showing up with love, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The room was still. A few people nodded politely. I felt a cold pit opening in my stomach. "And so," she continued, "in the spirit of unity and love, we've decided to take a small but meaningful action today that reflects what true family support looks like. Emily's sister, Tessa, has been going through a very difficult time financially. She's working hard to get back on her feet." There it was. That damn tone. The soft glove preamble to a punch in the gut. "And we thought," Mom said, her voice shaking just a little, whether from nerves or guilt, I couldn't say, "what better gift could we give on a day like today than the gift of grace?" So with the help of a few family members, she nodded at Aunt Claire and Cousin Ben like they were in on the heist. "We've redirected all of Emily's shower gifts to help pay off Tessa's outstanding debts and give her a fresh start." Laughter, at first. Light, confused. Someone actually clapped. One of Tessa's friends said, "That's so beautiful," like she was watching a goddamn Hallmark movie and not a live betrayal. Then the silence hit. Real silence. The kind where everyone in the room looks around to see who's going to move first, because they know something terrible just happened, and nobody wants to be the first to say it. I didn't say a word. I didn't stand up, or cry, or scream. I just stared at my mother while she smiled at me like she'd just handed me a crown, not stripped me bare in front of everyone I loved. That's when Jake walked in, calm as ever, like he'd been waiting for a cue only he could hear. He nodded to me, then pulled a manila folder from the inside of his jacket and walked straight up to my mother. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call her names. He just handed her the folder and said, "We prepared for this." Her face cracked before she even opened it. That little twitch at the corner of her mouth, like she'd been caught peeking at the answers during a test she thought nobody else had studied for. Inside that folder were copies of financial transactions, forged documents, emails from Tessa asking for money under my name, and screenshots of my mother acknowledging it all in texts she assumed no one had saved. There were even notarized letters from Jake's lawyer, outlining potential charges, and a printed email thread where Mom had tried to get a few family members to keep things quiet. She started flipping through it, faster and faster, her hands shaking. Then she looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw real panic in her eyes, not anger, not manipulation, not smug disappointment. Panic. "What is this?" she asked, her voice thin. Jake shrugged. "The truth. You gave away Emily's gifts. We figured we'd bring something of our own." Margot laughed loud, sharp, one note. It broke the silence. A few guests looked away, pretending to check their phones. Tessa stood frozen, her fake tan somehow looking paler by the second. I stood up. I didn't need to say anything. Jake had already said it all. I walked past my mother, past Tessa, past the cupcakes and flowers and ridiculous napkin rings with my name embroidered in cursive. I stepped outside and finally took a deep breath, the first real one in weeks. The door behind me stayed closed. And in that silence, I realized something awful and liberating at the same time. They hadn't just taken the gifts. They had given me a reason to leave. What would you do if your own family publicly humiliated you at your own bridal shower? Would you walk away or burn the whole thing down? Jake always said that people like my mother don't change. They just get better at hiding their patterns until the moment you let your guard down. I used to think he was being cynical, maybe even a little paranoid, but over the years I started to realize he was just paying closer attention than I wanted to. When you grow up in a family where keeping the peace means swallowing your voice, you learn to ignore the signs, even when they're flashing red and screaming at you from the inside. It was 3 weeks before the bridal shower when Jake asked me if I trusted my mother. We were sitting on the couch late at night, one of those half-silent evenings where you're both too tired to watch a movie but too restless to go to bed. I was scrolling through seating charts on my laptop, trying to figure out if Aunt Claire could sit near Cousin Ben without starting another argument about politics. Jake was nursing a glass of bourbon, staring at nothing in particular, and then he said it calm, direct, like he wasn't asking about table arrangements, but about the very core of my life. I didn't answer right away, because how do you explain to someone that trust in your family isn't a clean yes or no, but a kind of exhausted maybe you whisper to yourself because it hurts too much to say no out loud? So I said something like, "She's not perfect, but I think she wants what's best," and he just nodded like he knew that was the safest answer I could give, not the truest one. Then he told me about the voicemail. It had come the week prior, while he was in the garage on a call with one of his clients. My mom hadn't realized she left a message. She thought she hung up. But what came through, crackled, partial but unmistakable, was her voice telling someone she was handling the wedding details and that Emily doesn't need all that stuff anyway. Then she laughed, not loud, just enough to curdle your stomach. There was something else about redirecting resources, and though the call cut off before the context was clear, the intention rang louder than any words. Jake replayed it for me, and I listened with my hands clenched around a pillow, so tightly the seams started to split. I knew that tone. That dismissive, smiling cruelty she always used when she was about to do something unforgivable but wanted to dress it up as kindness. I didn't cry, and I didn't scream. I just sat there with a quiet rage blooming in my chest like a storm cloud that had finally realized it no longer had to stay above the ground. That's when Jake suggested we start gathering everything. Not to build a legal case, because we weren't interested in courts or judges or dragging things out through official channels. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. This was about being ready, about having the truth in our hands before someone else tried to rewrite it for us. Because when you grow up in a family that lies with a smile and cuts with praise, the truth becomes your only real weapon. So we pulled out old text messages, the ones I had saved over the years, not because I thought I'd need them, but because some part of me never really believed I was overreacting. There was the time Tessa texted me asking for $2,000 to cover rent, claiming Mom would pay me back next week, which never happened. There was the thread where she admitted to using my name on a car insurance application because her own record was too bad. There were the emails from Mom saying things like, "It's just easier if we help her through you," as if I was an extension of her guilt, a tool to prop up the daughter she couldn't let fall apart on her own. Jake took it further than I would have dared. He requested copies of old bank statements that showed my name attached to a joint account I never authorized, one that Tessa had clearly used and overdrafted multiple times. He contacted a friend in cybersecurity to help recover deleted messages from an old iCloud backup, ones where Mom had written to Aunt Claire about keeping things quiet and not rocking the boat before my bridal shower. And then there were the phone calls Jake had taken to recording his conversations with my parents, not because he was looking to trap anyone, but because he said it was the only way to stay sane when people constantly shifted their story. When someone makes you question what you remember, he said, you need something that can't lie. And he was right. We had recordings of my mother agreeing to cover the catering, then claiming a week later that I never asked. We had my father mumbling apologies for not stepping in sooner, but never actually stepping in. The folder started as a manila file stuffed with papers, then became a sleek black binder with tabs and color-coded highlights. Jake treated it like it was sacred, not because it was full of secrets, but because it was finally, for once, our version of the truth. Unedited. Undeniable. A record of all the moments my family had tried to twist into something more convenient. We didn't talk about what we'd do with it until the night before the shower. I asked Jake, "Do you think this will actually make them stop?" He looked at me, long and hard, and said, "No. But it might make them shut up." It was a strange kind of comfort, knowing we weren't planning to explode anything, just quietly hold a mirror up and let them see what they'd built. If they chose to look away, that was on them. But we'd be ready, no matter what happened. And somewhere in that quiet readiness, I found a new kind of strength I hadn't known I was allowed to have. Because when someone tries to humiliate you in public, you don't always need to raise your voice. Sometimes, you just hand them the truth and let it do the screaming. If you asked my mother, she'd say Tessa was just misunderstood, that she had a big heart and a little trouble finding her footing in the world, like a butterfly caught in the wind. But if you asked anyone outside our family, anyone who'd ever loaned Tessa money, hired her for a job, or believed one of her hollow promises, you get a much sharper picture of the girl who spun disasters and then smiled sweetly while someone else cleaned up the shards. My sister didn't start out cruel, I don't think. As kids, she was wild and loud, the kind of child who ran barefoot through the backyard even in winter, laughed with her mouth open, and somehow convinced everyone she was just spirited. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the good student, the kid who remembered to feed the dog and turn off the oven. When Tessa broke things, I apologized for her. When she cried, I was the one who fetched tissues, sat beside her, and said nothing that might be used against me later. It became our rhythm, her chaos, my cleanup. And somewhere along the way, the family stopped seeing it as a pattern and started seeing it as a fact of life, like gravity or the weather. My mother would say things like, Tessa just needs a little help, or you know how your sister is, in that tired tone that always ended with me reaching for my wallet, my schedule, or my sense of self-respect, and offering it up like tribute. By the time I was 19 and working 2 jobs during college, Tessa had already dropped out of 2 community colleges, gotten fired from 3 entry-level jobs, and borrowed money from me no fewer than 5 times. All for emergencies that turned out to be concert tickets, a new tattoo, or bailing her boyfriend out of jail. And every time I confronted her, she'd find a way to twist the knife. "You're so uptight, she'd say, rolling her eyes. "It's just money. You act like I killed someone." The Christmas I turned 25 was the one that stuck with me most. It was the coldest winter we'd had in years, the kind where your breath hung in the air like smoke and the frost crawled up your windows at night. I had been eyeing a wool coat for months, something simple, dark blue with a thick lining, not even expensive, just practical and warm. But 2 days before I planned to buy it, Tessa called me in tears. She said she was 2 months behind on rent, that her roommate had moved out without notice, that she was scared she'd be evicted and have nowhere to go. I asked why she hadn't told Mom or Dad, and she said they were too judgmental and that she didn't want to ruin Christmas. So I wired her $600 that afternoon and shivered my way through the rest of the winter in an old denim jacket layered over 3 sweaters. On Christmas morning, Mom handed Tessa a thick envelope filled with cash and a new iPhone to help her get back on track, while I got a crockpot I never asked for and a pair of novelty socks. When I brought up the coat, Mom looked confused and then said, "That's what big sisters do. They take care of the ones who can't take care of themselves." And maybe the most twisted part is, I actually believed it for a while. I believed that sacrificing for her made me good, that being the responsible one meant I had to bear the weight without complaint. Because what was the alternative? Let her drown? Watch her spiral? Make my parents cry with guilt because their youngest couldn't get it together? Over the years, Tessa perfected the art of the comeback. No matter how many times she failed, fired, evicted, dumped, arrested, she always had a way back into the house, the family, the conversation. She could walk into a room after 6 months of radio silence, flash that practiced half-tearful smile, and everyone would melt. She'd hug Mom like she'd just returned from war, not rehab, and within minutes they'd be back in the kitchen, sipping tea and talking about how the world was just too hard on some people. What they meant, of course, was that the world was too hard on Tessa. And someone had to soften it. That someone was always me. It wasn't just money. It was time, energy, reputation. There was the time she used my name as a reference for a job she later ghosted after 2 days, leaving me to answer angry follow-up calls. Or the time she showed up to a work event I invited her to and ended up flirting with my boss so aggressively that I had to apologize for her behavior in the Monday meeting. Every time she made a mess, I absorbed it. Every time she burned a bridge, I offered mine in exchange. And every single time, my mother acted like this was normal. Like this was family. Even when I got engaged, the focus shifted almost immediately. Tessa cried when I told her loud, theatrical sobs, and said she was happy for me but also sad that we were growing apart. "You're leaving me," she said, as if I were betraying her by moving forward. A week later, she posted a passive-aggressive rant on Facebook about how some people pretend to have their life together just to feel superior to their more authentic siblings. I didn't respond. I just deleted the app for a while. When the shower invitation went out, Tessa didn't RSVP. My mom insisted she'd come anyway and not to make a big deal about it. And of course, when she walked in late wearing a floor-length white dress with a thigh-high slit and diamond-studded heels, Mom beamed like royalty had arrived. Looking back, it's not that I didn't see the web she wove. I just didn't want to admit how many times I'd let myself be caught in it. Tessa was the spider, sure, but I was the idiot who kept crawling back into her nest, hoping maybe this time she wouldn't bite. But this time, something had shifted. Maybe it was Jake's certainty. Maybe it was the folder. Maybe it was finally seeing my mother's expression when the truth slipped through her fingers like sand. Whatever it was, I knew something had broken, and I wasn't the one who needed fixing anymore. Because when you spend your whole life tangled in someone else's chaos, it's easy to forget what peace even feels like. But the moment you step outside the web, the silence is almost beautiful. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon when Aunt Margot called and invited me to lunch, her voice sharp and unceremonious, like she'd already made the decision for both of us, and was simply giving me the courtesy of knowing when and where to show up. She chose a little cafe downtown, one of those places with chipped white plates and mismatched chairs that always felt more like someone's grandmother's kitchen than an actual business, the kind of quiet corner where nothing important was ever meant to happen, which made it the perfect place for something important to finally unfold. When I arrived, Margot was already seated by the window, a black coffee in front of her, half drunk, no sugar, no cream. Her eyes met mine, and she didn't smile, which I appreciated more than I expected, because a smile would have meant pretending, and we were both far too old and far too tired for that sort of thing anymore. I slid into the seat across from her, and before I could even reach for the menu, she said, "I'm not going to apologize for how I handled things at the shower." Her voice was low and clipped, but steady in the way only truth can be. "I wasn't expecting you to," I said, and I meant it. Because the truth was, she was the only one in the room that day who hadn't looked at me with either pity or passive aggression. Margot looked out the window for a long beat, her fingers drumming softly against the ceramic cup. "You know, your mom wasn't always like this," she said finally, and I could tell by the way she said it that she didn't mean it as an excuse. "But she's been broken a lot longer than you think. She just got good at hiding it." I waited, not sure where this was going, but knowing better than to interrupt. When Margot told stories, they came out slowly, like peeling wallpaper from a wall that had been covered in layers for decades. "She had a brother," she said, voice just above a whisper. "His name was Henry. He was 7. Died in a lake accident. I was only 5, so most of what I know is from watching everyone else unravel. But your mom, she took it harder than anyone. He was her twin." My breath caught in my throat, because somehow, no one had ever told me this before, not a single word in all my years of wondering why my mother always seemed to be protecting something invisible, holding onto something I couldn't see. "I didn't even know she had a brother," I said, and Margot nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she'd long suspected. "They stopped saying his name after a while," she continued. "Your grandmother boxed up all his things, and your grandfather drank more than he talked, and Linda, she just folded into herself. Started acting perfect, controlled, neat. It was like if she could hold the whole damn world together, maybe she wouldn't fall apart, too." The pieces started to shift in my head, not falling into place, exactly, but loosening enough to let in a new shape I hadn't seen before. My mother's obsession with perfection, her need to curate every event, every holiday, every family photo, always so clean, so posed, so hollow beneath the surface, it all started to hum with the sound of a grief no one ever taught her how to bury properly. "But what does that have to do with Tessa?" I asked, because I needed the link, the connection, the bridge between a dead boy and the sister who had drained my life like a leech and still gotten to be the favorite. Margot sighed, long and slow, like she'd been holding this part in her chest for too many years. "Tessa was born when Linda was already unraveling. I think she saw something in her, some wildness, some softness, maybe even a shadow of that boy she lost. And when Tessa started falling apart, it triggered something in your mom. A need to fix her. To protect her. Not because she deserved it, but because Linda couldn't bear to watch someone else die. So she started compensating. Making excuses. Covering tracks. But she didn't protect me," I said, not bitter, just stating a fact I'd been chewing on for decades. "She used me to protect Tessa." Margot looked at me hard, her mouth a thin line. "I know," she said. "And I'm not telling you this to ask for your forgiveness. I'm telling you because sometimes we have to see the full picture before we decide if we want to keep standing in the frame. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. I stirred my tea even though I hadn't added anything to it, just needing to move, to process, to keep my hands from shaking. She always made me feel guilty for needing anything, I said eventually, not quite sure who I was talking to, Margot, the window, or myself. Like I should be grateful for every crumb, every scrap of attention. And when I pushed back, she acted like I was attacking her. Like setting boundaries was some kind of betrayal. She loved you, Margot said quietly, and I almost laughed, because it didn't feel like love, not the kind that nurtures, anyway. Maybe, I said. But she didn't choose me. Not once. And there was the truth I hadn't let myself say out loud, the truth that had lived in my gut like a stone for so many years, making me smaller, quieter, more pliable. My mother had loved me, perhaps, in the way you love a lamp that never flickers, a faucet that always runs clear. But she had chosen Tessa, over and over, with the kind of blind, desperate loyalty that leaves no room for fairness or reason. Margot reached across the table and put her hand over mine, her skin cool and dry. You get to break the pattern, Emily, she said. You get to decide if you keep playing the role they wrote for you, or if you start writing your own. The words settled in my chest like a slow exhale. Maybe it didn't make what my mother did okay, but it made it make sense. And sometimes, that's the first crack in the armor. The moment the front door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the noise and the clatter of the party still happening inside, like some absurd echo chamber of denial, I felt the kind of stillness I hadn't known in years. It wasn't peace exactly, more like the dead calm after an earthquake, when the world hasn't yet realized it's shifted permanently, and everything looks deceptively normal while the cracks wait to reveal themselves. I stood there on the porch, sunlight warm on my back, listening to the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and small talk that somehow continued as if the center of it hadn't just imploded in front of 50 people. Jake followed a few moments later, silent but solid, his presence a kind of anchor I didn't realize I'd been clinging to until the rope tugged taut behind me. He didn't ask if I was okay, which I loved him for. He knew better than to insult me with that question. Instead, he just slipped his hand into mine and waited, and that silence between us said more than any whispered reassurance could. Eventually, we left. No dramatic exits, no doors slamming, just a slow walk to the car and the steady hum of tires against pavement as we drove back to our apartment. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared out the window with a numbness that felt like armor, and Jake kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting gently on my knee, not moving, just reminding me that I was still here, still real, and not about to disappear under the weight of my own composure. It wasn't until the next morning that the first text arrived, my mother, of course, asking when I was ready to talk like adults, as if she hadn't just tried to rebrand public theft as a noble act of family unity. I didn't respond. I read the message 3 times, then set the phone down without typing a single word. A few hours later, she called. I let it ring out. Then Tessa sent a long message that started with, "I'm sorry if you feel hurt," and ended with, "I was just as surprised as you." I didn't bother reading the middle. By that evening, my father called. His voice was quiet, tired, and measured in that way he always used when trying to smooth over something he'd had no part in fixing, but still felt responsible for. "Maybe we can all sit down," he said, "have dinner, talk this out." As if it were just a misunderstanding. As if someone had spilled wine on a rug, not rewritten the entire story of my life, and expected me to smile while they lit the match. 2 days later, I agreed to meet them, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to hear them say it out loud. I needed to look into their faces while they tried to spin it back into something forgivable, and I needed to not flinch when they realized I wouldn't be playing the quiet daughter anymore. They chose the living room of their house, which felt ridiculous, like staging a hostage negotiation in the middle of a Better Homes and Gardens photo shoot. Everything was overly tidy, the cushions fluffed, a candle burning on the side table that smelled like lavender and lies. Tessa was already there, perched dramatically on the arm of the couch like a wounded bird, eyes wide and glassy like she'd practiced looking remorseful in the mirror. Mom stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight. Dad hovered near the dining room, pretending to be neutral, pretending this wasn't going to end in blood. I sat down without being asked and let the silence build. "You embarrassed us," Mom said finally, her voice clipped and cold. "That was neither the time nor the place, Emily." I looked at her, let the words sink in, and then tilted my head slightly. "You mean when you announced that you stole from me in front of 50 people? You're right, that was a strange time and place." Tessa made a little wounded noise and reached for a tissue. "It wasn't like that," she said. "I didn't know. Mom didn't tell me everything." Jake, standing behind me, calmly set the black binder on the coffee table like it was a final piece of evidence in a case everyone already knew was lost. He flipped it open without drama and began to read. Not loudly, not with anger, just firmly, page by page, as he recited each documented incident like a priest reading sins from a ledger. On June 17th, 2 years ago, Tessa used a credit card opened in Emily's name to purchase $3,000 worth of electronics. Charges were disputed, but the account remained open. Linda opened her mouth, but Jake didn't pause. On September 9th, a check from Emily's bank account, forged with a poorly copied signature, was cashed. Surveillance footage at the bank confirms it was Tessa. Tessa let out a soft whimper, but still said nothing. On December 5th, a joint account was opened in Emily's name without her consent. It was overdrawn within 2 weeks. The mailing address on file? Your house. Mom's face was a mask of disbelief, outrage, and thinly veiled panic. "Why are you doing this?" she hissed. "What's the point of dragging this all out?" I finally spoke again, my voice low but steady. "The point is you knew. You knew what she was doing, and you didn't stop it. You justified it. You encouraged it." "It's complicated," my father said from the shadows. "No," I said, without looking at him. "It's really not." Linda's voice turned sharp again, desperate. She needed help. "She's had such a hard time, and I've had to pay for it," I interrupted. "Literally and emotionally. And you stood there every time and told me to be quiet. To be the bigger person. To remember she's my sister." "Well, I remember." The room cracked then, not physically, but spiritually. The tension that had always hummed beneath our family dinners, our holidays, our birthdays, finally split wide open, and nobody could pretend it wasn't there anymore. "You owe me an apology," my mother said suddenly, her voice breaking into something pitiful. "After everything I've done for you," I stood up, my chair scraping back slowly, deliberately. "You haven't done anything for me in years that didn't come with strings and a sermon. And I'm done pretending that's love." Jake gathered the binder and followed me toward the door. I didn't slam it on the way out. I didn't need to. The silence I left behind was louder than any goodbye I could have screamed. And for the first time, their shame wasn't mine to carry. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes after a storm, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that leaves you grateful everything is over, but the sharp-edged, sober kind that forces you to look around at what's left and admit out loud what you've known all along. Some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some people aren't meant to stay. And some family ties were never tied with love to begin with, just fear, guilt, and the quiet hope that maybe next time would be different. The morning after we confronted them in the living room, I sat at our kitchen table with the wedding guest list in front of me and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Jake was in the next room, on a call with the caterer, going over final headcounts and menu changes, but all I could hear was my mother's voice echoing in my head, that awful, breathy accusation, "You embarrassed us." As if betrayal only counted when it happened in public. As if all the private violations could be wiped clean as long as no one saw the blood. I stared at the names for a long time. At Rick and Linda Harper, printed in soft gray ink on our embossed wedding stationery, perfectly aligned under the reserved family seating section. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride in that woman's presence. How many birthdays I let slide without confrontation. How many holidays I showed up to, smiling through gritted teeth, watching my mother hover over Tessa like she was something breakable and divine, while I poured wine and cleared plates and bit my tongue until it bled. Then I picked up a pen, crossed their names out slowly and deliberately, and wrote in thick, block letters right across the page, "Not invited." It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like oxygen. Jake didn't flinch when I told him. He just nodded, said, "I'll update the venue list," and kissed my forehead. He knew what this cost me. He'd watched me untangle myself from their web thread by thread for the past year, sometimes gently, sometimes with a scream, but always with that same haunted look in my eyes, the one that said I didn't want to be the daughter who gave up on her family. But I was already halfway out the door. Rick called that evening. His number lit up my phone screen with a kind of weight I could feel in my spine. I answered because I needed to, because somewhere under all the layers of disappointment, I still wanted to hear if he would fight for me or if he'd just beg me to keep pretending. His voice was low, cautious, like he already knew he was walking into a minefield. "Emily," he said, "your mother's upset." I almost laughed. Upset didn't begin to cover it. She was probably pacing their living room like a warden who'd lost control of her prison. I imagined her listing all the things she'd done for me over the years, all the Christmas presents, all the lectures, all the times she'd shown up uninvited and expected applause just for being there. "She's not the only one," I said, keeping my tone flat. "You both crossed a line." Rick sighed, that familiar tired sound that always preceded a coward's apology. "I know," he said. "I just wish you'd talk to us before making a scene. We could have worked something out." "A scene?" I repeated, blood rising in my ears. "You mean the part where you stood there while she stole my wedding gifts and gave them to Tessa? Or the part where you said nothing while Jake laid out proof of fraud you helped hide?" He didn't deny it, just hesitated, then muttered, "I was trying to keep the family together." Jake walked into the room right then, holding his phone. Without a word, he pressed play on a voicemail we'd both heard more than once, but this time we let it speak in the silence between us. Rick's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakable, said, "She's going to find out eventually, but maybe we can keep it quiet for the family's sake. Emily's tough. She'll understand." I put the call on speaker and let it hang there in the air. Rick didn't speak for several seconds. Then, in the quietest voice I'd ever heard from him, he said, "I thought I was doing the right thing." "No," I said, my voice steady, my decision already made. "You thought silence was easier." And maybe it was. But it ends here. He started to speak again, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg, but I hung up before he could. I wasn't interested in a half-meant apology, dripping with self-preservation. I wanted the dignity of walking away with my head high and my name untangled from theirs. The next day, Linda showed up at our apartment. Jake saw her through the peephole first and asked me if I wanted him to handle it. I said no. I wanted to see her. I wanted to watch her face when I told her she was no longer welcome. When I opened the door, she didn't even wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the entryway like she owned the air around us, wearing a pearl necklace and fury like armor. "You are unbelievable," she snapped. "Uninviting your own parents from your wedding? Do you have any idea how that makes us look?" I shut the door slowly, turned around, and faced her. "I don't care how it makes you look." She stared at me, eyes wide with righteous indignation. "We are your family." "You were supposed to be," I said. "But you chose her." Again, and again, and again. "She's your sister," she said, as if that explained anything. She needed help. "And I didn't?" I asked. "Do you know how long I waited for you to see me? To stand up for me? To even ask if I was okay?" "You're no daughter of mine," she said suddenly, voice trembling, eyes blazing. "Not after this." "Good," I said, stepping back. "Then I don't owe you a damn thing." For a moment, the world stopped moving. She stood there, shocked that I didn't cry, didn't reach out, didn't beg her to stay. And I stood there, finally, completely still in my own power. Jake appeared behind me, and Linda turned to him like he was the source of it all. "You did this," she hissed. "You poisoned her." Jake didn't blink. "No," he said. "I just helped her see the truth." She stormed out after that, slamming the door behind her so hard a frame on the hallway wall tilted sideways. I didn't fix it, because some things deserve to stay just a little off-center, to remind us that not everything broken needs to be put back the way it was. Especially not us. The days after the confrontation bled into each other like watercolors left too long in the rain, soft edges smearing into something hard to name. Grief, maybe, or anger. Or some new alloy of both that carried the weight of truth without offering the comfort of resolution. I kept moving through wedding checklists like they were survival tasks, confirming vendors, finalizing seating arrangements, sending last-minute changes to the photographer. I smiled at fittings and tastings and all the little pageantry of the day we'd been planning for almost a year, but something inside me had quieted, not broken exactly, just retreated like an animal too long chased from its den. There were moments, sharp and fleeting, when I would think of my mother's face in the doorway, twisted with rage and disbelief, as if I'd taken something from her she was entitled to. And then I'd remember my own voice, steady and strong, saying the words I never imagined I'd have the courage to speak out loud. Good. Then I don't owe you a damn thing. I didn't regret saying it. I only regretted that it had taken 32 years to get there. Jake kept everything on track with the kind of quiet focus I'd always admired in him, never pushing, never rushing, just steady hands holding the shape of the life we were still trying to build. He asked me every morning if I wanted to elope instead, offered to drive us to the mountains or fly to some coastal town where we could say our vows barefoot in the sand and forget the ghosts still whispering behind us. But I always said no, not because I wanted the big wedding, but because I wasn't going to let my family's dysfunction write the final chapter of something we had worked so hard to create together. And still, something gnawed at the edge of my piece, a kind of unfinished melody that played beneath the logistics and lace, the phone calls and floral arrangements. It came to me most clearly in the quiet moments, like when I folded Jake's socks or watered the plants on the balcony, moments when my hands were busy and my mind wandered back to the kitchen table, to the look on my father's face when I hung up on him, to the silence that followed. It was during one of those moments, a Thursday morning wrapped in clouds and birdsong, that the letter came. I found it in the mailbox, nestled between a catering invoice and an RSVP envelope. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly, precise and slanted, the kind of cursive only taught in Catholic schools and unlearned by everyone except the people still clinging to it like a badge of virtue. Rick Harper, my father, the man who had spent his life walking the fine line between passive agreement and moral absence, had sent me something he couldn't say out loud. I read it on the kitchen floor, the pages trembling slightly in my hands, not because I was nervous, but because I knew before opening it that it wasn't going to give me what I wanted. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just something heavier, understanding. He began simply, "Emily," and then paused for 3 whole lines before the next sentence appeared. "Your mother will never forgive me for this, but I needed to say something you might already know." He didn't try to defend what he'd done, or more accurately, what he hadn't done. Instead, he laid it bare, line by line, like a confession whispered through paper. He wrote about the fear he had lived with, not of violence or volatility, but of disruption. He admitted that he had seen the favoritism early, that he knew how Linda bent the world around Tessa's needs like a tree grown crooked from years of leaning toward a single light. And he admitted that he had let it happen because it was easier to agree than to resist, because resistance made his wife angry and made his daughters drift away from each other in silent, invisible ways. "You are always easier to love quietly," he wrote, "and I'm sorry for how I mistook that for not needing to love you loudly." There was no direct apology, not really. He never said, "I'm sorry I let this happen," only that he wished he'd been stronger, that he saw the cost of his silence now and knew it couldn't be undone. And then, in the last paragraph, something I hadn't expected. Tessa checked herself into rehab. For real, this time, I think. She asked me not to tell you, but I believe you deserve to know. I don't expect you to reach out, and maybe you shouldn't. But she said something that stuck with me. She said, Emily finally gave up on me, and maybe that's what I needed. The final line was scratched a little, like he'd written it slowly. You did the right thing, even if it broke us. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it inside the drawer where we kept warranties and takeout menus, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't need to reread it. I already knew what it said. It didn't offer closure, only confirmation that sometimes doing the right thing means choosing your own survival over someone else's comfort, and that the cost of freedom is rarely clean or simple or kind. The night before the wedding, I stood outside our venue beneath a sky smeared with the soft gold of a setting sun, the kind of sky people always describe as hopeful even when they're filled with sadness. The chairs were lined up, the lights were strung, the air was warm and thick with lavender. Jake came up behind me, rested his chin on my shoulder, and asked if I was ready. I think so, I said, though what I really meant was something more complicated, something like I'm ready to walk forward, even if some parts of me are still dragging shadows. We didn't talk about who wouldn't be there. We didn't talk about the empty seats or the names missing from the program or the family that had fractured like old porcelain and decided I was the crack, not the hand that dropped it. We just stood there, watching the light fade, knowing that sometimes the cleanest cuts are the deepest ones, and healing doesn't always look like repair. When I walked down the aisle the next day, my hand in Jake's, the room was full but not complete. And somehow that was enough.